Good afternoon, and welcome to a special Middle East Forum podcast on Syria on the Brink. My name is Lauri Regan, and on behalf of MEF, I want to thank you all for joining today and for your continued support for the critically important work that we do. We are joined this morning by Sirwan Kajjo, a journalist and researcher specializing in Kurdish politics, Islamic militancy, and Syrian affairs, and Kamal Chomani, a non-resident fellow at the Kurdish Peace Institute, who will be sharing their insights into the events of the past week as the Syrian government, under President Ahmad al-Sharaa, sent its military forces into the Kurdish-led Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, also known as Rojava, with the intent of destroying the U.S. allied Syrian Democratic Forces. I'm going to interview Sirwan and Kamal for about 20 minutes, and the remaining time will be open for audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A or chat function at the bottom of your screens to enter your submission, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. Today's podcast is being recorded and will be available for future viewing, so please do share the link with those in your network who you believe would be interested in learning more on this timely topic. Welcome, Sirwan and Kamal, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. Sirwan, I'm going to start with you. I wanted you to start by providing some background on the situation in Syria beginning over a decade ago when the Syrian Defense Forces were formed following the rise of the Islamic State in the part of Syria bordering Iraq where ISIS attempted to build a caliphate. Can you please share the role of the U.S. in partnering with the Kurdish militia, as well as its relationship with the SDF through the fall of the Assad regime, and what the SDF may have expected from the U.S. once al-Sharaa, a former member of al-Qaeda, took over the Syrian government?
Hello, Laurie. Thank you so much for having me back on your podcast. So about a little over a decade ago, in 2014, Kurdish forces, primarily the People's Protection Units and Women's Protection Units, were defending the Kurdish town of Kobani on the border between Syria and Turkey. And this is part of Aleppo province, the province. During, this was at the heat of the civil war, where there were multiple factions, different Islamist groups, and Islamic State taking control of large territories of north and eastern Syria. The Kurds showed an amazing effectiveness in defending the town, which propelled the U.S. military to intervene. This was during the Obama administration. And basically, that's where the partnership started. So Kobani was saved from the violence that happened elsewhere. Of course, the local Kurdish forces sacrificed many of their fighters. But because of their effectiveness and discipline, about a year later, the United States decided to expand that partnership to other parts of ISIS held territories. So the partnership formed into something much larger. With the help of the United States, the Kurds built the Syrian Democratic Forces. The Kurdish forces were the core elements of that force, but it included many ethnic Arabs and Syriacs and Christians and even a small Armenian unit. So it was a multi-ethnic force supported by the United States that basically became the spearhead of the global fight against ISIS in Syria. They eventually liberated the entire region that was occupied by ISIS during the civil war, culminating in the March 2019 territorial defeat of ISIS. The global coalition announced that on the ground with their Kurdish-led forces. And so during that period, over the last 10 years, the relationship evolved into basically the goal for the U.S. military on the ground was to turn the SDF into an anti-ISIS force, which it was very effective for the entirety of that partnership. They together built specialized forces that targeted ISIS sleeper cells, which are still active, and now we see their reemergence. They also were able to establish more specialized security forces, not only in the Kurdish heartland, but also in Arab majority areas like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. And the SDF, these Kurdish-led forces, didn't directly control these areas, but they had established local security or military councils that were part of this larger coalition. So Raqqa, for example, which is an Arab city, since liberation from ISIS in 2017, has been controlled by locals and local forces that were in alliance with the Kurdish forces, and of course with the US-led coalition. Of course, the Kurds were hoping that this solid partnership, and I should say that I embedded with US military twice during that campaign. US commanders told me how happy they were of this unique partnership with a non-state actor. But in many cases, it was much better than even with many allied countries. The SDF has shown effectiveness, discipline, and also a desire to build a project that will ensure that the ISIS couldn't come back until 2024, basically, with the toppling of the Bashar al-Assad regime and the arrival of a former jihadist, former al-Qaeda operative, Ahmad al-Sharaa, who basically installed his new government. And of course, dynamics changed. Kurds still had good faith in the new changes and new dynamics by reaching out to Damascus and basically showing willingness to cooperate both politically and militarily until March 2025, where the two sides, with the help of the United States, decided to establish an integration process where the SDF as a unified force will join the Syrian military. And this was one of the most contentious point of contentions between the two sides. The Syrian regime wanted the SDF fighters to join individually, while the SDF wanted to keep the force as an intact unit for obvious reasons that we see unfolding right now in these days in northeast Syria. Of course, with the decision to take over eastern Syria, especially Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, the SDF basically withdrew from these areas with major defections among their Arab allies in these areas. Basically, overnight, these people who were with the SDF switched sides. And now the situation on the ground is very unstable. The Kurds are in one particular province, Hasaka province, that's in the far northeast, and with a small pocket of control in the town of Kobane that is currently under siege. The same town that became a symbol a symbol of resistance for Kurds and for the Americans and many people around the world is now under siege by many Islamists and jihadists who are part of the new Syrian Arab army.
Thank you so much for that background, Sirwan. Kamal, I'm going to turn to you. In an article written by Kamran Matan that you reported on X, he stated, international politics is grounded in the pursuit and expansion of strategic interests. What Kurdish political leadership has almost always failed to grasp properly is the complexity of state interests in the international arena and the tactical fluidity of the means through which those interests are pursued. Can you expand upon that by explaining what you believe led to Syria's President Ahmad al-Sharaa deciding now is the time to destroy the Kurdish-led, what's known as Rojava, and in particular, the previously U.S.-supported Syrian Democratic Forces, its military wing. Similarly, Kamal, what do you believe led to the Trump administration abandoning an ally of over a decade that helped the U.S. wipe out ISIS in Syria?
Thank you so much, Lauri. First of all, let me start by saying something very clearly. So it's not for the first time that the Kurds understand that, the United States is not a reliable long-term partner, in which they were thinking that the United States will be a long-term partner. We have an experience with the United States in 1975 during Henry Kissinger. So Mullah Mustafa Barzani revolution was abandoned. And then in 2017, again, it was after the war against ISIS. Again, the Kurdish referendum for independence in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So again, the Kurds were not supported by the United States. However, yet, yes, it is true that the Kurdish political leadership has also often miscalculated international politics. But at the same time, I think that explanation alone is too easy. And frankly, we may not do justice to them. So the real tragedy of the Kurds, I believe, is structural. The Kurds are not facing one hostile state in the Middle East. As you know, after the World War I, the Kurds were divided into four countries. So the Kurds are surrounded by four aggressive nation states: Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. However, I have to say, with partial exception of Iraq in recent years, because Iraq now has a democratic constitution since 2005, where a federal arrangement has resolved somehow the Kurdish question. However, at the same time, these countries disagree on almost everything, except one thing: opposing Kurdish self-rule. time and again, the Kurdish issue is the one file that brings these rivals together. So you remember when all these four countries, after years of rivalry, came together again. So what choices do Kurds really have among these four countries, like three somehow big empires, Persian Empire, Turkish Empire, and also Arab Empire? So the Kurds do not have so much choices, simply because they also don't have a state. So they do not have also strategic depth. So what they can do other than betting on international politics? So betting on international politics is not naive idealism. It is the only option available for them. But now, why did Ahmad al-Sharaa move now? For example, like recently, they moved. So there are several reasons. However, the most important thing is the regional and international environment changed in his favor. So from the day that Bashar Assad regime fell, so he was celebrated by the majority of Arab countries, especially strong Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, as well as Qatar, rich country, funding Islamic terrorism in the region. At the same time, Turkey has been, propping up Ahmad Sharaa since day one, when he was in Idlib, even before that, when he was also part of Al-Qaeda. And then now Damascus, today, feels more confident than at any time since the fall of Assad. So the new Syrian leadership believes this is the moment to re-centralize the state. So centralization of the Syrian state is part of the strategic thinking of the new leadership in Damascus. So they want to eliminate parallel institutions, especially the Kurdish institutions in the north and east of Syria. And of course, they want to establish a monopoly over force, over power, over all the institutions. That's why when they arrived in Damascus, they easily consolidated power, and also they drafted a constitution in their own favor. That's why Ahmad Sharaa now is supposedly like a president for the next 5 years. So from their perspective, the Kurdish-led democratic administration and also the Syrian Democratic Forces represent the last major obstacle to that goal, to re-centralize the state. First, they start with the massacring of Alawites, then massacring the Suwaida. So what's left for them other than the Kurds? And also in Syria, only Kurds have their own protection forces. So this move was also enabled by diplomacy. So let's not forget, when the new Syrian regime established in Damascus, so many people were thinking that Israel and the United States and also the European Union, the majority of the Western countries, will not normalize a former jihadist terrorist easily. But now we saw every country that are seeking their own interests. The Europeans want the influx of the refugees to stop. They want some immigrants, refugees to send back. And the United States, they have no more, the new national strategy of the United States is not Middle East is not the priority. And for Israel, they also want to have their sphere of influence in the south. So it seems that the Paris talks and US mediation reduced Damascus' external risks. So what's left for them now, other than, re-centralizing the state, regaining the power that they think that they have lost lost in the north and east of Syria. And also they were the new regime in Syria, they were very much how possible Kurds can rule Arab majority cities like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. As Sirwan Kajjo said, the Syrian Democratic Forces is only 40% were Kurds. The majority were non-Kurds. But it's true the Kurds were leading. It was also psychological that Kurds should not only have their own. So it's impossible for the Kurds in their own perspective that they should not rule the Arabs, but also it's impossible for them to have their own self-rule. So as for the United States, as I said, this is all about interests, not emotions or loyalty, because, for the Kurds, loyalty matters a lot, because as Sirwan said, the Kurds have offered over 10,000 martyrs during the fight against ISIS only in Syria, apart from in Kurdistan region of Iraq, that they were also around, I think, 3,000 Peshmerga lost their lives in the fight against ISIS. So for Washington, as we saw from Tom Barrack's statements, that, the file of SDF was primarily for the war against ISIS. And now the Syrian state has re-centralized the state. They can be part of, as they have become part of the global coalition to defeat ISIS. So the SDF should be dissolved and the file of SDF should be closed. And then that's the golden opportunity for Ahmad Shara and also his forces, as well as Turkey, to re-centralize the power in Damascus and also to dismantle the Kurdish gains, the Kurdish hard gains in the past 15 years in their fight against Assad, in their fight against al-Qaeda, the Turkish-backed forces, as well as the Islamic State and other extremist groups. So sadly, there have always been such kind of mistakes by the United States. At some point, they supported the Shah regime, and then they overthrew the Shah regime. Khomeini came, the mullahs came, and then they consolidated power. At some point, they even supported Saddam, and then only to later, destroy and also overthrow Saddam. And then at some point, they were also supporting Islamists against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The same Islamists took power, and then they overthrew the same Islamists as Taliban, and then Taliban came to power. So now is the moment that, again and again, the U.S. mistakes are repeating themselves in the Middle East. So now we, like Tom Barak and several other maybe State Department people may think that diplomacy has won in Syria, but I believe it is just short-lived. And in the next maybe not years, even months, we will realize that normalizing a jihadist terrorist group without having conditions for him and his own forces in Damascus, I think the repercussions or the consequences will be very, very disastrous in the future.
Thank you, Kamal. You covered a lot there. And some of what I was going to actually ask Sirwan, I think I'm going to switch things up a little bit, Sirwan, and ask you to talk about Turkey's role in Syria, which I find very problematic for Israel. While Trump's plan seemingly allows Israeli maneuverability and influence in southern Syria while handing the north over to Turkish influence, Turkey's role is still problematic from an Israeli national security perspective. For instance, Turkey recently installed an air traffic control system at the Damascus International Airport, which, according to Israeli defense sources, has a clear military aid intelligence impact on Israeli and regional air operations, possibly affecting the freedom of action of the IAF in Syrian airspace and complicating routes to Iran. Can you spend a few minutes discussing Turkey's role and influence in today's Syria and how you see this playing out? Because certainly the destruction of the SDF is beneficial to Turkey.
So, yeah, that's a great question. I think also since day one, since the eruption of the Syrian civil war back in 2011, Turkey's policy towards Syria has primarily been driven by its anti-Kurdish, policy, basically. So since day one, Turkey has supported elements within the Syrian oppositions that were Islamist, that were anti-Kurdish, and that served Turkish interests in the country. Even as they were fighting the Assad regime, Turkey was able to build a coalition of jihadist and extremist groups. Most of them were, by the way, established within Turkey, in Turkish territory, and then by Turkish MIT, the intelligence agencies, then sent into Syria to not only fight Assad, but also fight the Kurdish forces. And through that partnership with those proxies, Turkey was able to capture much of Kurdish territory in the north, and especially the northwest. And so right now, I would say like half of Kurdish land in Rojava and Western Kurdistan is under direct Turkish control. Turkey also right now, with the arrival of al-Sharaa, has secured the driver's seat in when it comes to policies not only towards Kurds but in Damascus. From a Damascus perspective, Turkey controls the narrative when it comes to to the Kurds. They devise policies for the foreign minister, who's probably more loyal to Turkey than to Damascus. They advised in almost every single foreign trip that foreign Syrian officials have had. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan is present, including Ahmad Shara''s visit to the White House back in November. Hakan Fidan was also present in Washington at the time to ensure that every step that the Syrian regime takes, and whether it's toward the Kurds or other regional issues, Turkey will have a larger input in those decisions. So Turkey does control much of Syria. They're rebuilding the Syrian defense and communications infrastructure. So like you mentioned, Lauri, they just installed some the Syrian government said that this was only for civilian purpose, but of course we don't know what's going on. And I also believe that Turkey feels that having not only a partner but a loyal ally in Damascus will ensure that Turkey keep use that as leverage against Israel, not only in Syria but in the broader regions. It's really hard to imagine a successful Syrian government from Damascus perspective without the direct support of Ankara and Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And as long as that support is there, we will see all kind of attacks and antagonism against the Kurds in the north and the northeast. Turkey has for a long time opposed the creation of a Kurdish entity, even if it's a one within Syria, one that didn't seek separatism or partition of Syria. Turkey still viewed that as a threat to its national security. And during this whole time, since the Kurds have been in control of the north and the northeast, there hasn't been one incident when Kurdish fighters used a bullet against, on towards the other, fired a bullet toward the other side of the border. So Turkey has presented a very hyperbolic narrative. Unfortunately, many in the West and particularly in the United States believe that narrative that Turkey being in charge of Syria is possibly the best outcome from the Syrian civil war. And like Kamal eloquently said, unfortunately, that is very short-sighted. Turkey is a malign actor in the region. They've proven time and time again that they are anti-American. They are a NATO ally, but Turkey has shown over many issues, including the recent protests in Iran, that Turkey is always in support of countries that oppose the United States and Israel and their interests in the region.
There are a couple of questions in the queue. And Kamal, I'm going to tie one to something that I was curious about, which is what's going on with ISIS. Wall Street Journal's reported that the U.S. is moving ISIS prisoners in Syria to jails in Iraq. But there's clear video on social media together with lots of reports of perhaps even hundreds of ISIS terrorists who have been imprisoned, having been freed by Syrian forces. And then there's stories of beheadings of Kurdish women and children by ISIS terrorists. So someone had asked that, do you think the Americans genuinely do not see that they are supporting a new ISIS-style jihad in Syria? What are your thoughts on that, Kamal?
I believe, the ISIS, they were ticking bomb, and the ticking bomb is exploding now. And that's why we have already seen some U.S. diplomats in the Middle East may not understand what the mess they have done in Syria. But the communities across Iraq, across the region, they understand. That's why the Yazidis, I talked to some Yazidi friends in Shingal yesterday. One of my friends, he said, they are already trying to leave Sinjar and to go to the Hague, because probably the same ISIS extremists, they will be released by the Syrian regime and they will massacre the Yazidis again. That's a real, we have seen Yazidi activists actively tweeting and calling international community to protect them. The Iraqi government already understood. The Kurdish Peshmerga, they have already understood. That's why the Iraqi prime minister announced there should be better cooperation and coordination between the Peshmerga and the Iraqi forces. And you have seen the Shia forces also moving toward the Syrian border, because they are scared that a new wave of ISIS is emerging. And it's a real threat, because the most dangerous Iraqi, Syrian, and international extremist jihadists were in prison, were in Al-Hol and also other campus. But now majority of them will be released. Even if they are not released right now, probably they will be embedded with the new Syrian Arab army, because we have seen that those who were part of the Islamic State are now part of the Syrian Arab army. And they have seen, the moment we saw the Syrian Arab army attacks on the Druze and Alawites, and then recently on Kurds in Aleppo, in Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafiyah, and now in the other parts of Rojava, exactly the same acts that the ISIS were perpetrating, we are seeing the same acts, like killing women, like labeling women as insulting women, beheading people, killing civilians, all sorts of mass killings, and then killing political prisoners. So that's why we are deceiving, we are fooling ourselves if we think that we are not strengthening, we are not helping the reemergence of ISIS, partly because of the prison breaks, and also mainly because the international community are supporting a force in Damascus that's very similar to the Islamic State. So that's the situation, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is unfortunate, Kamal. So we just have a couple minutes. I'm going to try to get to some of these questions that are just being entered in the queue. And someone has asked, this is for both of you, whoever wants to chime in, or both of you, what are the chances of Trump snapping back sanctions on Syria, and what red line would al-Sharaa have to cross? And I'm going to expand that a bit because I saw a report, and it's pure rumor, that perhaps the quid pro quo in Trump's decision not to support the SDF was al-Sharaa agreeing to a peace treaty with Israel. So if anybody has any thoughts on those points, please.
Sure. I can go first. I think, some lawmakers, some US lawmakers have floated the idea that they are willing to work on something to bring back at least some of those sanctions, and that were just released about a month ago, Caesar sanctions against the Syrian regime. If these violations and these abuses and attacks against the Kurds and other groups in Syria continue by the Sharia regime. So the possibility is there. I just don't believe that it has enough support. You know, the Trump administration has made it clear that it's siding with the Syrian state. It's siding with Ahmad al-Sharaa. I don't know how much it will take for the Trump administration to be persuaded to take more aggressive action towards its government, but it seems that, US allies in the Gulf have done a very effective job in terms of making sure that, and of course they are lobbyists in DC, that, this US support will continue no matter what happens on the ground. So I'm a bit skeptical about whether these sanctions will be reimposed. The whole process was very lengthy, and I don't think bringing back is easy, but I don't think there is enough will in Washington. There are a lot of voices that are opposed to this, growing with like Lindsey Graham, many other senior senators and other lawmakers are raising their voices. I just don't think they have gained the momentum to turn it into more tangible actions in that sense. Maybe Kamal can answer the second part of your question, Laurie.
I just want to add something to what Sirwan said, which I completely agree with him. First of all, sanctions are not enough. Even if sanctions are, again reintroduced to the Syrian state, the Syrian new army will not stop massacring the Kurds and the minorities. And we have seen that sanctions never stop the Iranian regime to kill protesters, to kill, the opposition or oppressed people in Iran, or to stop its expansionism in the region. Even Turkey, there have been some sanctions, but nothing has shaped the attitudes of these aggressive states in the region. So what we were expecting from the United States is actively stopping the advance of the Syrian Arab Army and its factions, it is Turkish and also Turkish backed forces, when they advance toward the Kurdish territories, like what the Israel did when the Syrian forces headed toward Suwaida to massacre them. They have to be stopped because, sanction, they understand, during the sanction, they can do what they want, and then the sanctions might be lifted in the next 5 years. And let's also not forget, sanctions will not be effective simply because right now, the new Syrian regime is supported by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, by Turkey. These three countries will always be able to support the new Syrian regime enough to be able to consolidate power, to expand their own territories, and also to be used as a proxy state whenever they want to use Syria against Kurds, Israel, or any adversaries in the region.
Thank you both so much. There's a couple of questions that we didn't get to, but we are planning a podcast on Monday to follow up on the topic of Syria as well. So please, everybody that had questions that weren't answered, please plan on joining us on Monday. And thank you all for joining us today. Kamal, Sirwan, thank you a million. As always, brilliant insights, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to join. I wish everybody a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.